So, to get this channel started, I figured a good first video would be going over one of my fundamental philosophies around movement. And this is that if you can move, you can improve. And we'll get into a little bit more about the specifics of what that all entails in a little bit. But to start, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am, sort of what has led to this point. I was very active as a child, engaging in multiple forms of martial arts up until medical conditions forced me to stop around middle school. Some years later, I got really into powerlifting, achieved some pretty decent numbers at the body weight I was at. And through training, like everybody else was training around me, I ended up getting some pretty serious injuries, which some led me to not be able to walk for a decent amount of time. Others I was able to more or less recover from pretty quickly. But as I started racking them up, I started being more and more limited in what I was able to do and the things I was able to engage in daily life. Come to find out, I have many different genetic health conditions, such as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS, and then some other ones like fibromyalgia, primary insomnia, ADHD. But the ones that impacted my life and my ability to engage in physical activities most was the POTS and the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. But if you don't know what POTS or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is, the POTS is essentially a condition that makes it so my body doesn't know when to constrict my blood vessels, so that when I go through postural changes, normally what happens in healthy individuals, the blood vessels constrict so your body can continue pumping blood to your brain. Whereas when I and others who have POTS go through a postural change, let's say from lying down to standing up, the blood vessels don't constrict, they stay open, and so all the blood sinks. Then the heart has to work much harder in order to keep pumping blood into the brain. This often results in the heart not actually being able to keep up with the demand placed on it, and thus resulting in passing out. And even when the heart can't keep up, it generally results in much higher than normal resting heart rates. The Ehlers-Danlos syndrome I have is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome type 3 hypermobility. And this essentially makes all of the connective tissue in my body very weak and loose. Some quick examples I can show you from my skin. I can also dislocate and relocate almost every joint in my body, although I'm not going to demonstrate that because that further deteriorates my body. Initially, after receiving these diagnoses, my response is really like, fuck the system. I'm going to do whatever I want to do, regardless of what diagnoses I have. And then that kind of caught up with me. I learned very quickly that I can't just do whatever I want to do with no regard for the actual state of where my body is and what it can handle. And so over the course of about the past little over a decade now, I've been through countless doctors, in and out of PT basically my whole life. And really, up until the past few years, just kind of guessing, throwing shots in the dark. But when I really started investing myself in education, specifically around movement, exercise science, adaptations, nutrition, that's when my body really was able to start keeping up with the demands I was placing on it, because I was placing demands on it that actually resulted in it getting stronger over time. And so that leads us to today. So I want to get into a little bit about what doctors and physical therapists would tell me as I was going through this whole process of figuring out my diagnoses and figuring out how to deal with it, trying to get back into sport. And I want to start by saying doctors are not evil. They're usually not just sheep of big pharma. They're trained and educated in very specific ways and to a very high degree. However, this level of specification in their education generally shapes their worldview and shapes how they view solutions to any given problem. They're rarely educated to really any degree on nutrition or exercise science, but they are very highly educated in the problems they're specifically trained to handle. So I think this is important to keep in mind, especially for people who have chronic conditions. Doctors are trained to treat the things they most often see. But so often, nutrition and exercise science is overlooked. When I was going through the process of trying to figure out what was going on with my heart, every different specialist that I went to thought that I had a different condition. For example, a cardiologist thought I had POTS. The ear, nose, and throat doctor thought that I had overgrown inner ear crystals that were throwing off my equilibrium and making me dizzy. The neurologist thought I just had vertigo. So I think this harkens back to the analogy surgeons cut. That's just what they do. If you're going to a certain type of doctor, they will find the solutions that they most often find, regardless of whether or not that's the best solution. Around my Ehlers-Danlos syndrome diagnoses, I so often got the advice to not put stress on the joints that I was experiencing difficulty with, to avoid exercise, to avoid anything that was high impact or high stress on the body. And I very much acknowledge that the doctors were well-meaning when they gave me that advice. However, I think it really overlooks the strength of the human body and its ability to adapt to so many different situations. However, when you don't use a body part for a prolonged period of time, it gets weaker, it loses its ability, and now you become less resilient to the stresses of daily life, thus increasing chances of injury. So the advice to just not use a body part that is experiencing pain or weakness or instability, while I think it is entirely well-meaning, I think it is the wrong advice to follow. There are absolutely exceptions to this. For example, immediately post-surgery, that you probably shouldn't walk out of a operating room and immediately go to the gym. But in general, moving a body part, if it is intelligently and progressively implemented in order to strengthen the body part over time in a way which minimizes injury risk while doing so, I think that is always a better approach than completely not moving the body part, which will, at the very most, prevent acute injury, and at worst, it will cause more and more pain, instability, and weakness over time. So now with regards to physical therapists. Physical therapists, at least the good ones, are trained to take people from barely functional to functional enough to get through daily life, right? That's what they're really specialized and really effective at doing. However, they're rarely informed on how to take people from moderate levels of functionality to being highly functional, to the point where you're setting personal records and you're actually able to engage at a very high level in your sport or in your activity. And so that gets into the actual topic of this video, which is if you can move, you can improve. So to start, what does this mean? What do I mean by that phrase? What I'm saying here is that if you have any range of motion with a given joint in a given movement pattern with little to no pain, you can train that joint to become stronger, more stable, and more functional, and have a bigger range of motion over time with proper implementation of progression. So why am I able to make this claim? Basically, if you have any range of motion, then you are able to do resistance training. Regardless of how little resistance, how little load you have, you're able to take a given muscle group and a given joint through some range of motion with some load. Thus, you're able to implement progressive overload. You can create positive adaptations, and you can become stronger and more functional over time. The good news here is that both muscles and tendons can experience positive adaptations and become stronger in response to mechanical loading and in response to resistance training. That means that we can improve our level of function over time as long as we can move that body part even a little bit. So now that lends the question, how can we accomplish this, right? So first, let's define the goal. The goal is to create stability, control, and a strength through the biggest range of motion possible in order to start talking about what we can do to create these positive adaptations. It's important to talk about what makes for effective hypertrophy training. And one of the key factors that influences hypertrophy in an exercise is taking a given muscle group or a given tissue through its maximum range of motion and placing a big stretch on the target muscle, ideally when you have the most tension on that muscle. So there are exercises that take a given muscle group through a full range of motion, but the target muscle is almost unweighted when you get to the fully stretched position. We want exercises which place the most amount of tension on the target tissues when it's in that fully stretched position. Next, slow and controlled eccentrics. For example, in bench press, the portion where you're lowering the bar down to your chest. The eccentric portion we know is substantially more hypertrophic than the concentric portion or the peak contraction, and second only to the peak stretch. There's likely not much unique benefit to a peak contraction for most muscle groups. However, there are a couple exceptions. Next, and this one is a pretty vital point here, is that anything between 5 and 30 reps per set is equally beneficial for the sake of hypertrophy and creating positive adaptations in muscle strength. And that training closer to failure is more effective for this purpose than training farther away from it. However, considerations around ability and stability of a given tissue and joint needs to be taken into account, especially in the context of rehabilitation. This rep range is very important for us to keep in mind because the wider of a rep range we have to work with, the longer we can give our connective tissue time to adapt to a given load while still implementing progressions over time and thus becoming stronger before needing to go to a higher load, thus placing more stress on the connective tissue and on the joints. All of these things kind of shape how we can go about getting stronger over time. And it actually gives us a lot of variability and a lot of wiggle room with how we can go about doing so, which is really good news because everybody's bodies, every joint, every injury requires unique approaches in many ways. And so having these kind of fundamental principles that we can use as rules to follow constrains the options that we have while still giving us many different ways that we can go about addressing any given problem. And so from all of this, we see that the advanced applications of hypertrophy training via these fundamental principles, they align perfectly with the goals of increasing joint and tendon health, as long as they're progressed properly. Connective tissue adapts to much the same stimulus as do muscles. So if we are training our muscles to grow and become stronger with maximal efficacy, then with some modifications as to how we go about it, we can also train our connective tissue to become stronger and to be able to handle more over time. So how do we go about training in this way? A distinction needs to be made here between pain-free training and pain threshold training within the context of injury rehabilitation. So there's a study by Hickey et al. In 2020 that studied athletes recovering from a hamstring strain. And they placed them into two groups, each which performed the same hamstring rehabilitation protocol. One group trained as far as they could with no pain, and the other group trained up until a 4 or less out of 10 on the pain scale. And notably, the two groups had no statistical difference in their time to recovery and their time to return to sport. But the group that trained to a 4 or less out of 10 on the pain scale, the pain threshold training group, they actually maintained and recovered their strength better than the no pain group. And I think this is a really important consideration to make here because post-injury, there can be a lot of fear around re-injury, right? Very naturally and entirely reasonably. There ends up being a lot of caution to not put too much stress on the injured area so that you don't risk re-injury. And this is entirely understandable. But I think often this turns into a blind fear and a blind avoidance rather than a calculated approach to risk. I encourage you to consider this when going about your own rehabilitation journey. I think caution and awareness is extremely beneficial. However, blind fear and blind avoidance will stop you from making as much progress as you otherwise could see. Now, specifically with regards to where to start in your training, the first step is to find that maximum range of motion through a given movement pattern that you can achieve with not a significant amount of instability, and at most a small amount of pain. And then from here, find a load or a weight where you can perform that movement pattern through that given range of motion. If you have to decrease your range of motion with a certain amount of weight, then you've gone too far. This could mean starting with no weight at all, just body weight, or even unloading the exercise in some way to make it so you're lifting even less than your body weight. An example of this is something like assisted squats, where you're holding onto a railing. Another example is pull-ups. Many people after a shoulder injury can't do full range of motion pull-ups. However, if they put 20 pounds on a lat pull-down machine, oftentimes they can get a pretty decent range of motion, and it's like nearly no weight, just because the weight of gravity of your arms almost counteracts that. Start conservatively. You want to find a weight that you can take through that maximum range of motion that you just found for at least 5 reps. And in terms of where to start with regards to number of reps, number of sets, the frequency, all of that, start off small. People often make the mistake of trying to jump into things and do way more than they maybe should be doing right off the bat. So I encourage you to just start with a simple 5 reps for a couple sets, and then watch how your body responds to that over the coming hours and over the coming days. You want to be able to tolerate the stimulus and the stress that you put on those joints. So if doing it makes you significantly more unstable and significantly lowers your function for the hours and or days after performing just those 2 sets of 5 reps, then it's probably a good idea to reduce the intensity via reducing load or even reducing range of motion a little bit. In terms of frequency for how often you're performing these couple sets of a given movement pattern, this should really be based on 2 things. One is how much volume do you need, volume measured as number of sets. How much volume do you need to consistently make improvements in that given movement pattern? And then the other thing is how much are you actually able to recover from? These aren't things that you'll just magically know right off the bat. These are things that you'll have to figure out over time. And really, you want to be functioning between those 2 levels of how much do you need to consistently make progress and how much you're able to recover from. We want to be somewhere in between there. But generally, a good place to start is 1 to 2 times per week for just a few sets. Now, I keep talking about progression, but how do we actually progress in this case? So every time you perform a given exercise, you should be aiming for some level of progression compared to the previous session where you performed that same exercise, with consideration for how your body is doing on that day, right? For example, the shoulder issue, if you woke up after sleeping on your shoulder really weirdly and it's just not feeling cool that day, it feels really unstable, maybe a decently elevated amount of pain compared to normal, listen to your body. Don't push it to arbitrarily hit some amount of progression beyond your past session. If in your past session you were feeling great, but this section you're feeling like absolute horseshit, if you know that your body is not going to be able to tolerate something well, or if you're even concerned about whether or not it will be, take it a little easier that day. Take extra long in the process of warming up and try to exercise some grace with yourself. Rehabilitation takes time, and trying to rush the process is just going to be counterproductive. So how do we measure progression between session to session? And that there's actually a hierarchy of progression in this specific context of rehabilitation. First and foremost, we want to make sure that we're progressing in our range of motion, our stable, relatively pain-free range of motion. Next, we want to progress in reps, and then lastly, we progress in load. And I'll get into each of these in a little bit more detail. I'd always rather see increases in range of motion rather than increases in weight or reps. However, once you've gotten to a certain range of motion that either is the maximum that you ever hope to be at, or the biggest range of motion that you can feasibly stay at for some period of time, then we go to the next level of progression, which is rep progression. So this is the number of reps that you perform in any given set. A simple way to go about this is just try to add 1 rep to each set compared to the last session that you did at the same range of motion and same weight. This way, you can be sure that you are creating some level of progressive overload so that your body is experiencing positive adaptations, getting stronger, both in the connective tissue and in the muscles. But also, you're not just immediately throwing on more weight, which can significantly increase the stress on all of the connective tissue on the joints and increase the risk of injury if you aren't yet ready to handle that increased load. That's where the rep range of 5 to 30 reps per set becomes very beneficial for us, because we have a very long time where we can progress in reps before it actually becomes prudent to increase weight. However, when you get to the upper end of that 5 to 30 rep range, you just start getting diminishing returns because the relative load is so little compared to your actual ability and actual strength. But once you get up to the upper end of that range, adding the smallest increment in weight possible, and then reassessing where your reps fall can be a very beneficial way of continuing to progress. This gives us a lot of time between each of our load progressions, thus giving our connective tissue the time it needs to get the adaptations needed to be able to support that load. This decreases the risk of injury as we progress while still ensuring that we are creating those positive adaptations over time. So as you become stronger, you'll start to find that a more specific rep range within that 5 to 30 rep range overall works better for certain muscle groups, certain joints, certain movement patterns than does others. Let's take lateral raises, for example, or even better, full range of motion lateral raises, where you take the dumbbell and you put it all the way overhead and then bring it back down to the starting position. If you're performing sets of that in the 5 to 10 rep range, the load needed to make it very difficult is way higher than the load needed to make it very difficult in the 15 to 20 rep range. And the stress and strain that you feel in the shoulder joint itself with those lower rep ranges because of the higher load ends up being more stress, more wear and tear on the joint than it's worth. So even if it creates the same level of adaptation, it's creating more damage and thus less progress over time than if you were to go with a higher rep range, create less damage and just the same amount of adaptation. And I'll get into this in a later video, but this is sort of the fundamentals of stimulus to fatigue ratio. It's the amount of stimulus you're getting for the desired adaptation that you want to create compared to the amount of fatigue and stress that you're creating in various tissues as a result of a given exercise selection or weight selection or rep range, whatever it is. Now, even once you identify a more narrow rep range that you find works better for you for a given movement pattern, a given joint, whatever it is, you'll still stick with the same model of progression as with the wider rep range that we were talking about before. So you're still going to progress range of motion primarily. Once you've hit a wall or the maximum range of motion that you want to go to, then you'll focus on rep progressions. And once you get to the top end of your rep range for that exercise, then you'll increase weight by a small increment, drop the reps down to as far as you can go while maintaining proper form, maintaining little to no pain, and maintaining stability. I hope this gives you a better idea as to a place to start when you go about trying to program your own training for the purpose of rehabilitation and for the purpose of achieving high levels of stability and function, strength, performance. There's not much out there in terms of programmatically how we can go about achieving these changes that we want to see. But I hope throughout the course of this channel and the videos that are being put out that I can start to illuminate a path forward. And if you have any questions about anything I talked about, if you have any requests for things that you want me to talk about in future videos, let me know in the comments below. If you found value in this video, please leave a like and subscribe to support the growth of the channel.